Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. At the recent Civil War show in South Boston, Virginia, I chatted with Colt Johnson. He's a collector of relics, photographs, and other items from the Civil War period. In fact, Colt had a table set up showing artillery relics, and he had some photographs also on display. I've known Colt for some years now, and I've seen him at past shows. He stopped by the table where Military Images was set up, and he shared the photograph that you see here. It's actually a photograph of a very well-known illustration known as the empty sleeve. You students of the Civil War, I'm sure you've seen this on numerous occasions. This artwork was inspired by a poem of the same name by a man named David Barker. Barker penned the poem after listening to a speech in Bangor, Maine on a July day in 1862. There was a speaker there, and the speaker inspired Barker with his words. That speaker was a Maine native, a man named Oliver Otis Howard. He's a Union general. He had suffered very recently 2 gunshot wounds in his right arm at the recent Battle of Fair Oaks, Virginia, which is part of the Peninsula Campaign. Howard was taken to surgeons. Surgeons could not save the arm. They amputated it. Now, Howard is touring the state of Maine, his home state, giving speeches to drum up support for the war, to express his patriotic spirit. Barker wrote this poem, published in a newspaper, and it goes viral in today's vernacular. It inspires a song and illustrations like the one you see here. Photographs of this illustration are mass produced and sold across the northern states. The photograph is important because it helped grieving families deal with disfiguring injuries that happened to their family and friends, missing arms, missing legs, horrible facial wounds and injuries. This photograph helped people deal with the grief. The back of this image is also worthy of note. In fact, it's quite intriguing and absolutely unique to my experience. Now, I've handled uncounted number of photographs, and I've never seen the stamp. It's really quite unusual. If you take a look at it, you'll see the outer ring is printed with the words, "The Soldiers News Agency." At first glance, I thought it might have been added in the early 20th century, but the more time I spent with it, I became convinced that, in fact, it was probably closer to the Civil War period rather than later in the 19th century or early in the 20th century. The reason I began to think that way is because the style of the letters, the way the ink hits the paper, it just has a feel from that period, that late war, early war period. So I did what I always do. I went online, did searches on Google, Google Books, and newspapers.com to find any information at all about the Soldiers News Agency. Nothing turned up. I was a little surprised. This led me to believe that possibly the Soldiers News Agency was maybe a short-lived local or regional idea with ambitions to go national, but maybe never achieved the big, bold, ambitious aims that it had. Maybe it was a business idea ahead of its time. Maybe it had competition from other news agencies. One thing is for certain, and it's this: during and after the Civil War, we're in a period in America of a massive media influx, mass media. In fact, very similar to the one we live in today. Back then, it prompted numerous startup agencies to distribute news and information across the country. So I went back to the stamp and then paid attention to the inner band, which says Pittsburgh Commercial, published by this agency. Now, that's an intriguing clue. So I set out to find more information out about the Pittsburgh Commercial. I got lucky there. It turns out that it was a daily newspaper, a morning newspaper, published for 14 years from 1863 to 1877, conveniently connecting to that late post war, or pardon me, late war, early post war period. Now, the editorial section of the commercial is very Republican. It's pro Lincoln, it's pro Union, it's pro veteran, pro soldier. And that's a nice bit of information when you consider that it may have explained how a soldier's agency was started. Then I took a look again at the stamp and noticed the big numbers in the center, 25 cents. Nowadays, if you can find an original carte de visite photograph, a small paper photograph of a soldier with an empty sleeve for that price, for a quarter, you'd better buy it. I'd buy it in a heartbeat. Back during the war period, 25 cents is about the right cost for a souvenir image of this kind. This made me convinced that the image definitely dated from the war period or early post war period. Now, I went back into newspapers.com and redoubled my efforts. The Soldiers News Agency, I typed in again, hoping that I'd find something. Again, nothing, disappointment. But I wasn't ready to call it quits. I then started searching a variety of other terms. I put myself in the place of Americans in the 19th century. What terms would they search under? They would use terms like crippled, invalid. I typed in those terms along with news agency, and boom, I got a hit. I got a result, a single result. I found a mention of the quote, crippled soldier news agency, end quote, in the July 30th, 1867 issue of the New York Times. The article discusses invalid veterans seeking to sell items in competition with newsboys and other street vendors in the streets of New York City. I read the article with some shock and some awe. It really took me to what was going on in the streets of New York City. And I came away feeling pretty certain that the story that I'm about to read you connects to this stamp and the photograph of the soldier, the photograph of the illustration of the empty sleeve. Let me read the story to you because I think you'll also get an appreciation of the daredevil newsboys who dodged streetcars and carriages to sell newspapers 6 times a day. 6 different editions of newspapers were released throughout the day to news-hungry New Yorkers. And of course, these poor disabled veterans who are competing with these agile boys and probably some girls to try to sell what they've got. So here's the story, and it's titled News at Retail in the Streets. Here we go. There ought to be considerable grace extended to that class of retailers who crowd around the streetcars with their stock of news, fresh as they can procure it, 5 or 6 times a day. They are noisy and clamorous to dispose of their goods. They often plague the jaded wayfarer when he has no disposition to buy, and they sometimes cheat, like a larger order of merchants, by selling for new that which is old, or by palming off a big sensation for a worthless thing of their own manufacturer. But the juvenile news dealers are industrious, and that, in their youth, has to be encouraged as far as may be. While they are peddling off their wares, they are measurably well out of mischief. They cannot attend to their trade and pilfer at the same time on any great scale. They are, moreover, less offensively obtrusive than ordinary street merchants, and the stand of cabbage leaf cigars, or rotten and half-ripe fruits, or villainous lemonade, or sour ice cream, or other vile compounds. Of the 2 classes, the small, noisy news merchant boy is by far the most worthy. He wins his proper place in a good fair share of popular sympathy and respect. But this suggests the thought that the street news dealer has a proper place and that he's sometimes found outside of it. It is horrifying to read, as we have been lately reading of youngsters employed in the peddling business being driven off the streetcars with unnecessary violence, sometimes to their fatal injury. But it is scarcely less horrifying to see the way in which they risk their own lives and alarm human spectators by jumping on at the front of crowded cars while these are running at full speed. The escapes every day, where no thoughtless conductor uses violence toward the intruder, and alarmingly frequent. And they will not be less frequent in the press in its steady desire to show up the faults of conductors and to keep what they suppose to be a popular warfare against railroad corporations should represent it as unfair and inhuman proceedings to forbid the news vendors the use of the cars outside of the different stations or at least in crowded and narrow streets. Passengers riding in streetcars are determined patrons of the news vendors, and they can nearly always make their investment when the car halts or at some point where the risks of bargaining are not serious. But whether passengers can always gratify their taste for fresh reading or not, the managers and agents of railroad companies, either within or without the city, deserve commendation rather than blame in preventing the travelers from tempting youngsters to expose themselves to needless danger. Perhaps the car peddling business has been often threatened to become a nuisance. The crippled soldier news agency is now, on some lines, a positive nuisance which all city people understand and which is presently mainly supported by our friends from the country. The invalided volunteer may be an honest enough fellow and well deserving of some support, but his employer simply makes a beggar of him and gives him at the same time a miserable share of the profits of his begging. The newsboy's business is legitimate, but it is out of place in a crowded streetcar, and any city president or manager will stop it absolutely, except at regular starting or halting points, and will deserve credit for preserving his humanity. So that's the story from the New York Times. And the essence is that you have streetcar peddlers, these newsboys. There's pressure on the newsboys to sell the latest edition, and they're clambering all over streetcars, basically inundating them, while the conductors, operated by the railroads, are trying to serve their customers. So there's a tension between the newspapers and the streetcar railroad companies. Into the mix comes these poor veterans who are disabled. They are trying to sell trinkets, newspapers, and photographs and other items. It's my working theory. And they're trying to compete with these young newsboys. So this New York Times editorial is basically saying, hey, the newsboys are trying to do the right thing, but they shouldn't be in danger. And also look at these poor veterans. They should be treated with some respect. So that is all that I learned about this single stamp on the back of a photograph. Thanks to Colt Johnson, and thanks to you for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.